First, it was the Duke, a modern replica of the North American version of the original Xbox controller. However, with the Asian and European markets got at launch, the Type S controller, which fit most hands a little bit better, has now been reproduced by Hyperkin. Although, unfortunately, to spoil a little something in the intro, this is my least favorite of the trio of Xbox reproduction controllers from Hyperkin, and I'm glad it exists. It kind of fills out the family, but it's definitely the scrawnier, less attractive brother that doesn't get a lot of dates. Let's get it. A quick disclaimer for my audience, the Stallions and Stallionettes. This controllers, plural actually, were sent for review. However, this is going to be an honest, comprehensive review. I haven't been paid or told to say or not say anything about them. Hyperkin doesn't get an early preview, and the thoughts in this video are 100% my own. So if there's any cons, shortcomings, or areas of improvement, you're going to hear about it. So these companies make better products over time. A little summary of what this controller is, some of its key notable features, and this is directly on the Hyperkin landing page. I've been browsing AliExpress, Alibaba, Wish, Temu, stuff like that for my Fly Digi controller reviews over the last couple days, and to be 110% honest, the site is giving off some Alibaba Express vibes with this low resolution photos, and some of these pop-ups just give kind of a stinky vibe. Anyway, it's just the site, who gives a shit? People that are browsing. This is a $50 wired controller for Xbox One and Series and Windows 10 and 11 PCs. It's wired, gonna keep weight and cost down for us, but in reality, we know when manufacturers take the only wired route, considering a wireless controller can go wired in a moment's notice, that decision was definitely a cost-cutting measure because they didn't have to source a battery and a wireless chipset, and they most likely couldn't get the licensing for the wireless technology. A very tight-ass restricted Bluetooth 5.1 on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Wireless, which is also restrictive on the Xbox consoles. The main reason anybody would buy this controller, or in my opinion, any of the wired Hyperkin controllers currently, such as the Duke or the Xenon, which is the Xbox 360 controller, which I compared directly side by side with a real OG 360 controller and did note some notable differences in the components, such as the face buttons, the tension of the thumbsticks, which I'm not going to touch on here. The video is linked in the description below. That was a huge complaint I had. But the reason anybody's going to pick up one of these wired Hyperkin controllers is because they're reminiscent of the old school Xbox design. They're a retro throwback to the original Xbox Duke. Then the Type S, which is also an Xbox original controller, which is the controller that they got in Asia and Europe day one with the console. But in North America, we started with the Duke, fucking too big, and we got the Type S controller. Now, there is Hall effect thumbstick modules on board, which is a first with these Hyperkin controllers. All the previous models did not. They rocked typical potentiometer sensor thumbstick modules. Now, they do say zero drift, and I hate to break some hearts and break some asses here, but if this is the thumbstick module on board, which we are going to see during a teardown or disassembly later, this has a typical recentering spring. You see these two gray lines that look like little rubber bands? Yeah, those can lose tension on you over time, which would give you stick drift. It's far less likely than a potentiometer thumbstick module, which has multiple physical points of failure, but this is some marketing hoopla. Zero drift, you actually can get stick drift with these. There are Hall effect thumbstick modules on the market, like the in-house Fly Digis, which I just took a look at a couple days ago, which in theory cannot get drift for you because that recentering spring, it does not exist. You do have impulse triggers, which isn't a huge selling factor, but of course they need to fill out this landing page with features. This just means that there's vibration in the triggers, a pretty standard feature for Xbox controllers, but it was not in the original Type S controller. Maybe that's why they're mentioning it here. Same thing with bumpers. There was no bumpers on the Xbox controllers. That was introduced with the 360. And what these bumpers are going to do is not only work like bumpers in a modern game, but also mirror or replicate the functionality of the white and black button, which I personally remember had some really cool functionality. For example, in Doom 3, white would be to turn on the flashlight and black was to open up your PDA, which I thought was kind of sick. Sorry, I cut the lights. You can barely see me, but it says complete the iconic Xbox replica trio. I have, and the reviews are linked in the description below. As for the unboxing and included accessories, I'm not going to touch the black box because this belongs to one of you Stallions or Stallionettes, and I know better than to touch another man or woman's property, so I'm going to set this aside. And the first one of y'all down there to type Duke, the big original Xbox throwback controller they made. The Duke, go ahead and put that down there. That's the keyword that's going to unlock this bad boy being sent out. I do ask that you're in North America for shipping purposes. Thank you very much. I'm going to hold on to the white one. Two of the key notable features on the box, well, actually I see three I want to touch on. The first one, Hall effect sticks. The This is the first Hyperkin controller to rock that. We're gonna take a look at the modules up close and personal and see what they're rocking. I'm gonna take a wild guess and say it's some variant of K-Silver's. Then you have the precision impulse triggers, which we talked about during the summary, is just vibration in the triggers. And then this little icon, I'm assuming, is saying there's a 3.5mm headphone jack, becoming quite a relic in 2024, as most gamers have made the jump to wireless headsets, and if they haven't, controller manufacturers give no fucks anymore. This is an officially licensed Xbox controller. If you've gotten a whiff downwind of the great controller ban and you're worried about that, every single controller I've reviewed on this channel still works. I unbox things for a living, and I'm having a hell of a time figuring out how to break into this box how the manufacturer intends. Minimal damage, you got a little catchphrase or slogan, let's game. I plan to, now that I'm in the box. 2002, a legend is born. That's when this controller dropped, and now 2024, we're getting a remake. Opening up these little flippy flaps is going to reveal your controller, which does have a couple of foam rings around the thumbsticks, little DuchesS branding in the box, cut out for your thumbs to get in there and easily access your controller. I'm assuming there's going to be some documentation under here. USB-C cable coiled up very nicely. You do have a little holographic sticker, looks pretty slick. You do have your quick start guide we'll take a look at in just a minute, and then a little thank you placard with their social media on the back if you want to rant and rave online about how sick your controller is, or if you have issues, there is a support email. Super basic instruction manual or quick start guide. This is it. There's no QR code to scan for a more in-depth manual, but this is a very basic wired controller. There's really not a whole lot of extra features to it. No remappable back buttons or trigger locks or a magnetic swappable faceplate or crazy stuff you need a 12-page instruction manual for. It's a controller. Plug it in, play with it. The only included accessory is the required 10-foot USB-C cable. It is not braided, rather it's got this microfiber sleeve, pretty smooth to the touch, and it does have a Velcro tie back which stays connected, but you don't have any dust covers on the USB-A or C end. A little bit of Hyperkin branding on both ends. And this cable is actually pretty lightweight and relatively flexible. Pretty important because since this is a wired controller, you're going to be using the included cable, which you don't have to. It's not proprietary, and you don't have some weird plastic shroud covering the USB-C port where you have to use a specialized cable. This looks and feels like the cheapest Hyperkin retro reproduction I have seen. What really throws off the cosmetics is a couple of factors. The main one is going to be the center section with this cheap looking sticker that says Xbox. In previous Hyperkin controllers, there was a little OLED screen where you could press this and it will replay a little startup animation, which was really cool, but I understand that was probably a pretty pricey feature. I think this just could have been gloss black or something, anything other than what looks so fucking tacky. To the right of it are going to be these facer action buttons, miscolored. If you look at the A button, the green looks a little bit off. And if you look at the face buttons from the side, there's this weird, you know what, I'm going to engage the macro lens, this weird little edge section where it completely changes design. It looks weird. The gloss D-pad is already collecting fingerprints and eventually micro scratches like nobody's business. And unfortunately, I do not have an authentic original Xbox Type S controller to compare this to. I do have a cheap generic USB $13 controller in the closet, but that's not a real Microsoft controller, so I'm not going to compare it to this. And thinking back, I'm trying to remember if the OG had the gloss D-pad, because if it did, Hyperkin has an excuse to include this because they're trying to stay true to the source material, the original controller. But if they decided to throw this gloss D-pad in for the fuck of it, please don't ever do that. Hyper gloss bumper and trigger suite up here, which is not very sweet. Looking through the lens of my camera or the little preview window, this looks okay on camera, but I'm telling you, you pick this thing up in hand, you're gonna think, what the fuck? This is a $50 controller? It's this, and these, and that, and these. As for the ergonomics or comfort, I got the Hyperkin family busted out. This is the latest and greatest what we're reviewing today. This is what started it all, the Duke, the OG North American Xbox controller, which actually, believe it or not, for my 5'11" hands, isn't that uncomfortable. I could actually play an entire game like this. It's not as comfortable as a modern controller, but I don't think it's as uncomfortable as people say it is. So these two are from the same console generation, but probably not best to do that. Just put it right next to it. This is a limited edition Hyperkin, which I think looks so sick. I do have the standard white version as well. I had to pick up the sucker on Amazon. It looks spicy. Wow. Unfortunately, I do have to report back that the Type S is the most uncomfortable out of these three. I'd have to rank the Xbox 360 controller top dog. The Duke, believe it or not, second place, because look at these ergonomic palm grips. This is actually a pretty good little ergonomic shape and shell design. And then the Type S, which has this nice fat haunch, which is going to bump into your middle and ring fingers. And then this kind of bulbous, bulged out palm grip shape really never felt good to me back in the day and doesn't now. Unfortunately, this is a pretty uncomfortable controller. I do believe that has to do with this cut in back here, as your middle finger doesn't really have a nice place to rest. It's kind of getting cramped up in there. Yeah, my three fingers cramped up on this little palm grip. I'm going to go ahead and give comfort a 5 out of 10. None of the previous
Hyperkin Throwbacks felt cheap. This one absolutely does. The plastics feel incredibly thin, cheap, porous, hollow, don't drop it, probably won't survive it. This little center section, the epitome of cheap with this little sticker. Face buttons, also weird coloration like I mentioned earlier. Not too big of a panel gap where the front faceplate and rear shell meet. I will say the 3.5mm headphone jack looks supremely cheap. Hold on, listen to this. This controller sounds straight up hollow, which we are doing a teardown or disassembly, so we're going to see exactly what's in the internals. This is the most toyish controller from a mainstream brand I've picked up in quite some time. I'm gonna go ahead and give the build quality, it sounded weird there, as this feels pretty fucking weird, a 4 out of 10. The D-pad is a mixed sack. I really do like the actuation force, but I really do not like the plastics used. Not only the fact that it's glossy, but it's also super slick. And then the shape kind of going for a hybrid, but definitely more of a 4-point than a wheel. And the 4-point, it's not jagged, it ain't gonna cut you or anything, but it definitely isn't comfortable. So when your finger's right up in here trying to do diagonal inputs or roll-offs in a fighting game, you have some issues. Also, I just don't really like the way that this little plastic dish sits in the front faceplate. Fitment-wise, it feels like a little bit of a bolt-on or an afterthought. This is a membrane switch, a typical rubber plunger mechanism under there. I like the resistance, and if you're just going for one of the 4 gates, up, down, left, or right, and you're not really worrying about diagonals, the D-pad feels pretty darn good. If you're picking this up for fighting games, I wouldn't. As for the face or action buttons, despite bashing them cosmetically, I actually do like the way they feel, size and spacing. They are still rounded, which I'm not a huge fan of Microsoft rounded buttons. They still do it on the Xbox Series controller in comparison to PlayStation, which rocks substantially flatter buttons. But spacing, they are definitely a lot more spaced out, so if you have larger hands, this is really nice to have this much space. Explore the yard, so to speak. Actuation force is good. Typical membrane switches, so these could get stuck in at any possible time, but very easy to unstick them. No issue here. They're serviceable. I'm gonna go ahead and give them a 5 out of 10. The D-pad is a 5 out of 10 as well. As for the accessory button suite, so that's going to be this Xbox button in the center, the share button, these 2 guys that we almost forgot about, and then the 3.5mm headphone jack. I'm also going to throw in the white and black buttons into the accessory button suite. First of all, I love the fact that there is the white and black buttons. 3.5mm headphone jack. You're not really seeing many of those anymore. That's great. Share button. Love to see that as well. And this LED light bar is a little bit bigger than it needs to be. It could just be a little dot, but it's kind of a large strip for a light. They didn't take some weird proprietary cable route, so that's cool. I'm going to go ahead and give the accessory button suite a 6 out of 10. As for the thumbsticks, joysticks, analog sticks, they are magnetic Hall effect thumbstick modules, which we're going to take a closer look at during the teardown or disassembly. They do not have very much resistance or strength compared to the Xbox 360 original, about the same resistance as the other Hyperkin controllers, which is a little surprising because these are using different thumbstick modules, the Hall effects versus the potentiometers that were in these 2, but resistance wise they feel almost identical, kind of a slap in the face to the OG controllers, which did have increased thumbstick tension, especially notably the Xbox 360 generation. Clicking down the sticks, L3 and R3 as it's called on PlayStation or Xbox, clicking in the sticks sounds very hollow and clacky, and I absolutely despise these thumbstick caps with the 4 dibbly dots. However, that is true to the original design, but the rubber silicone compound, super slick. What about KontrolFreeks? These are Nintendo Switch Pro controller caps, Inferno design. PS4 and 5 caps also fit perfectly, but I think the Switch feels just a little bit more snug, and the Xbox is too small diameter-wise and would damage the thumbstick caps. Back over here at the PC and some sections that won't be in this review because it's NA, non-applicable to this controller. There is no gyro, there is no touchpad, there is no Bluetooth, there is no software application, there is no battery on board, so no battery life. But over here in GPT wired, of course, because that's how this controller rocks, we are seeing a perfect resting value of 0.00002 on both the vertical and horizontal axes. Also, I will say these are incredibly responsive. There's no baked-in inner or outer dead zone. I'm having no problem reaching the outside of my thumbstick gates when at full lock, and also just feathering, braking neutral, very responsive. Let's get the circularity test, shall we? Very low as well. Keep in mind these are radial or circular thumbstick modules, not square or rectangular, which are known to have a higher value here in the average error rate, but as long as they're even, it's no real cause for concern. As for the bumpers and triggers, I am not a fan. The bumpers are these huge glossy bits. It takes a lot more resistance up here where the swivel or hinge mechanism is, and these are also collecting fingerprints like crazy. These are also incredibly slick or slippery, no dots or stippling of any kind, and the triggers are definitely my biggest complaint here, as there's no real comfortable way to hit them. I don't have very large hands, keep in mind I'm 5'11", pretty average, and when I squeeze these triggers, you can see my index finger is just all up in this back plastic here, and yes, you can hold your finger like that with a modified grip, but that's not very comfortable either, and it definitely feels like the range of motion motion or travel is substantially less than a modern controller. So if you're picking this up for racing games to modulate the throttle and brake, maybe don't. Also not a pro controller, so there's no trigger lock or stop system. The comfort here of always brushing up your index fingers when you're trying to hit the triggers, and then the fact that these bumpers also, you have to be cognizant to hit them pretty much here, not here. I'm gonna go ahead and give the whole suite up top 3 out of 10. It's not very sweet.
Getting our first input lag or delay test in X input. Nope, that wrong program there, bud. This is Gamepad LA. And you're gonna see about 4 milliseconds of input lag or delay, which might sound like a lot, but it's actually on the low end for the Xbox side of the house, because Xbox controllers on their native console get 4 or 8 milliseconds off a 250 or 125 hertz stock clock respectively, and that's when going wired or using Xbox wireless protocol. I prefer X input test because you get a little bit more data that you can scroll through. This does look very even. It's looking like 4s across the board, minus these 6 outliers. Run another one. Awesome. That is as close of a test as I can get. 1 outlier, which is probably going to be one large number at the top from when I first started spinning this. Nope. Well, there's a 7 in here somewhere, but we are indeed at 4 milliseconds of input lag or delay on a 250 hertz stock clock. Is this controller susceptible to being overclocked? In the Lord of Mass overclocking program, in the dropdown, select all, and we are going to be recognized as an HID compliant. Where you at, sweetheart? You're making me look silly. There we go. Xbox gaming device, not overclocked, stock clock, around 4 milliseconds. That's exactly what we're at, actually. Give the juice the squeeze, so to speak. Unplugging and replugging, we're now overclocked on 1000 hertz for what should give us 1 millisecond of input lag or delay. That's if we're not polling rate locked, which we most likely are, because this is based on the Xbox platform, and we already know at the PCB, they're generally locked down, as this one is, and we are stuck at that 4 milliseconds, which, like I said, isn't terrible. That is on the low end for Xbox controllers. Keep in mind, though, wiggly finger of don't forget, guys, there are third-party Xbox controllers that use wireless dongles that are going to get you around that 2 millisecond mark, but those are also wireless controllers that are about triple the price of what we're reviewing here today. As for converter or adapter support, since this is a wired permanent controller, that's the method that you're going to take. You can plug it into the back of the Brook Accessories NS2 for Switch or the XE2 for PlayStation 5, although that is limited to browsing the console and playing PS4 games.
It looks like 6 Phillips head screws hold everything in place. However, there's a 7th one hiding underneath that brand sticker, which definitely works as a tamper seal to let the manufacturer know the controller has been disassembled, which of course will void your warranty. I do recommend having the proper tools for the job and have a little cup to separate your hardware, which luckily with this controller is only one size screw, and that includes on the actual PCB. Now, when you use your pry tool to separate the front and rear shell, be careful because there is a rather beefy plug which leads to the USB-C cable. There is plugs on the PCB for the vibration motors, so if you want to remove those rumbles and then return them a later time, you could, as opposed to the old school method of just yanking them from the soldering. This is a great overview with the back of the PCB. You can see everything, the capacitors, everything you might want to. There are only 4 screws holding the PCB to the front faceplate, and underneath that you can see all your face buttons. If you wanted to remove them, paint them, replace them, here's your rubber plunger mechanism for the face button, D-pad just to confirm everything is membrane. Lifting up on the plastic thumbstick bases, they will lift up. I removed only one, but they are identical, and you can see that these are the K-Silver that I haven't seen in a while, and these definitely can develop stick drift as they do have a typical recentering spring. As you can see, I moved the shaft or stick around. Those little gray rubber bands which crisscross over each other, those can lose tension over time and cause stick drift. But one thing I do like to see is clicking down the sticks, there is a separate module on the side, which does take pressure off of the module, so the whole clicking down stick, speeding up stick drift debacle should be slowed down. For reassembly, hold the PCB with your thumb and then make sure that all the face buttons, D-pad, everything's pressing properly before tightening the board down. The bumper, which most likely popped out, can only go in one way, the correct way, and it's held on with these 2 white posts. Plug your cable back to the PCB, snap the shell together, return the screws, call it a day.
So as for the verdict section, this is the one retro Hyperkin Throwback controller that I personally wouldn't spend my own hard-earned money, as I did buy that limited edition 360 controller from Amazon, and I did also buy my own 20th anniversary Duke. After getting hands-on time with this controller, feeling how cheap the plastics are, and also analyzing the entire package, that this is a $50 wired controller when we're at a time where there are wireless pro controllers that have rear buttons and trigger stops and all kinds of hoopla that this controller doesn't. Although keep in mind, this has a different goal, and that is to work on the modern consoles and PCs with the old school design of an Xbox Type S controller, which they did nail, but it just doesn't really feel very good in the hand. And out of the entire Hyperkin trio currently, the Duke, I think, is actually pretty comfortable and just a huge dose of nostalgia. In fact, that's the main reason I picked up that controller, is so I could play through Halo 1 and 2 in the Halo Master Chief Collection on the retro graphics settings where it emulates the Xbox One. using a Duke controller so I could have the experience of playing the original. Granted, I could just hook up original hardware, but that's a huge pain in the dick. So unfortunately, I can't recommend spending $50 on the DuchesS controller, considering we live in a world where there are wireless pro feature having-ass controllers for under $30. And if you want to spend around $50, you can get controllers like the FlyDigiVader 3 Pro, which is currently on sale. And if you just wanted a wired controller with that nostalgia factor of the same shell of a Type S, the package could have been implemented so much better from Hyperkin, because out of the trio of retro throwback controllers, the Duke, the Xenon 360 controller, and then this Type S, this is the only one that feels cheap in hand. The other ones felt like a normal controller. In fact, the Dukes actually felt pretty premium with the plastics and had that cool OLED screen, which I thought was a neat feature. This controller has no neat features. Of course, the manufacturer is going to try and drum up a little hype by mentioning things like the impulse trigger vibration motors. Who cares about that? The fact that there's bumpers. Yeah, I should hope so. If it's a controller you're selling in 2024, you ain't gonna be bumping people off if there ain't no bumpers on it. Yes, Hyperkin, there's gonna be bumpers on board. This controller doesn't really do anything special for $50, and there's controllers that are half the price that run circles around it feature-wise. It is linked in the description below, and one of you is getting one of these suckers for free. Keep that in mind. Drop in the comments section below what you think of this gamepad, and I will see you Stallions and Stallionettes tomorrow. Peace. If you enjoyed the video, liking it helps it to get seen by more gamers, so this information will reach and assist them as well. Much like the back of the TV, I've got plugs for all of my socials down there in the description below. And your wallet will greatly thank you if you check the description, because there are exclusive discounts on a ton of products, including controllers, KontrolFreeks, keyboards, mouse pads, clothes, and energy drinks. And keep in mind that you, the viewer, keep this channel running. The more Stallions and Stallionettes trotting around the stable, the better, so mollywop that subscribe button like it owes you money, and we'll have the same amount of fun tomorrow.